Margaret's day began before the sun rose, just as it had for the past 23 years. The quiet hum of the world, waking up outside, never reached the small confines of her home, where time seemed to stand still. She moved carefully through the dimly lit house, her frail hands steady despite the weight of the years. In the corner of the room, Robert lay motionless in his bed, his body seemingly lifeless, but his presence an anchor in her life. She had devoted herself to his care since the stroke that left him paralyzed, never once questioning her duty. She began the routine she knew so well, adjusting his pillows, ensuring he was comfortable before preparing his breakfast. Soft, easy-to-swallow foods, just as the doctors had recommended all those years ago. She spoon-fed him slowly, speaking to him in a gentle voice, even though he never responded. His eyes would follow her at times, blinking in acknowledgement, and that was enough for her. She wiped his face tenderly, just as she had done every day, remembering the man he once was, the strong, capable husband who had provided for their family. After breakfast, she carefully lifted his limp arms, massaging them as the therapist had taught her. She whispered words of encouragement, telling him about the weather, the neighbors, and little things that made up their world. There were no complaints, no signs of exhaustion, only love. When she took him to the window in his wheelchair, she sat beside him, staring at the world outside, wondering if he missed it as much as she did. Every action was second nature to her now. It was a life of quiet sacrifice, of unspoken devotion. She never once considered leaving, never questioned if he truly needed her as much as she believed, until the day she did. Margaret had always found comfort in routine. It was the rhythm of her days, the quiet predictability of caring for Robert that kept her going. But lately something had begun to gnaw at her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. It started with small things, objects slightly out of place, the sensation that a chair had been moved an inch from where she last left it. At first, she dismissed it as forgetfulness, a simple mistake of an aging mind. But then there were other signs, ones she couldn't explain away so easily. She would prepare Robert's meals, carefully portioning out the food, only to find the plates emptier than they should have been. He couldn't feed himself. She had spent over 2 decades ensuring that every bite was given to him. And yet, the food seemed to disappear faster than she remembered. She told herself she was imagining it. Perhaps she had given him larger portions without realizing it. Perhaps exhaustion was clouding her mind, but the feeling wouldn't leave her. Then there was the night she heard a faint sound in the darkness. It was soft, barely noticeable, but in a house that had been eerily silent for years, it stood out like a whisper in a storm. She sat up in bed, holding her breath, straining to hear beyond the heavy stillness. A creak, a shuffle, something moving where nothing should be moving. She told herself it was just the house settling, just the wind outside. But the unease in her chest refused to fade. During the day, she started paying closer attention. The blankets on Robert's bed seemed different when she returned to his side, as if they had been shifted in a way that didn't match her careful tucking. The wheelchair, which she always left in a specific position, would sometimes be slightly turned. She watched Robert more closely, searching for signs of awareness beyond his usual blank stares. But there was nothing, only the same stillness, the same silence. Her heart grew heavy with suspicion, a weight she could no longer ignore. She needed answers, and for the first time in 23 years, she decided to seek the truth. Margaret sat in her chair, hands trembling slightly as she stared at the small camera in her palm. She had never needed anything like this before. There was never a reason to suspect, to doubt. For 23 years, she had moved through this house with certainty, believing that she knew everything that happened within its walls. But now, that certainty was slipping away, replaced by an unsettling unease that refused to leave her alone. She ran her fingers over the camera's smooth surface, hesitating. Was she really about to do this? Was she truly doubting the man she had devoted her life to caring for? The thought alone filled her with guilt, but something stronger pushed her forward, an instinct she couldn't silence. She had ignored the signs long enough. It was time to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Moving carefully, she positioned the camera in the corner of the living room, just above the shelf, where it would have a clear view of Robert's bed and the surrounding area. Her hands were steady now, her decision firm. She adjusted the angle, making sure it would capture every detail. The lens gleamed under the dim light, a silent witness to whatever was happening in her home. She glanced over at Robert, lying motionless in his bed, his face as expressionless as ever. His eyes were closed, his breathing steady, the same way he had been for over 2 decades. But was it real? Or had she been blind to something she never thought possible? The idea sent a shiver down her spine. That night, Margaret lay in bed, unable to sleep. The camera was recording now, silently collecting the truth she had been too afraid to face. Every creak of the house made her heart race. Every shadow seemed darker than before. She wanted morning to come, to pull the memory card from the camera and finally see for herself what had been happening while she wasn't looking. As the hours passed, she imagined all the possibilities, each one worse than the last. She had spent her life devoted to Robert, trusting in his helplessness, believing in his silence. But what if she had been wrong? What if the truth was something she could never have prepared herself for? The next morning, Margaret woke with a pounding heart, her body stiff from a restless night. She had barely slept, her mind consumed with thoughts of what the camera might have captured. As she sat up, she glanced toward Robert's bed. He was exactly where she had left him, motionless, his face calm, his body limp. She stared at him for a long moment, trying to push away the nagging fear that had settled deep inside her. Forcing herself to move, she rose from the bed and made her way toward the camera. Her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved the memory card, her breath shallow with anticipation. She told herself she was being foolish. What could she possibly find? What if she had wasted her time, and all of this was nothing more than an overactive imagination? But as she inserted the memory card into her laptop, she knew there was no turning back. The footage began, showing the quiet, predictable life she had lived for so long. The house was still, the only movement coming from her as she moved around, tending to Robert. The hours passed in fast forward until night fell. That was when everything changed. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she saw it. In the dim glow of the nightlight, Robert's body shifted. At first, it was just a small movement, his fingers twitching, his eyelids fluttering. Then, to her absolute horror, she watched as he slowly lifted his head, his eyes scanning the room with an awareness she had never seen before. Her pulse pounded in her ears as he sat up, his movements steady, deliberate. There was no struggle, no sign of the paralysis she had believed in for over 2 decades. Her shaking hands covered her mouth as Robert swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. He stood, he walked, he moved, as if the past 23 years had been nothing more than an illusion. Margaret's mind reeled as she watched him pace the room, stretching his limbs, rolling his shoulders like a man shaking off a long sleep. Then the final blow. He moved toward the kitchen, opening the cabinets with ease, pulling out food and eating with his own hands. Margaret felt sick. She had been feeding him, caring for him, sacrificing her own life for him, and he had been deceiving her all along. Her world, everything she had believed, had just come crashing down. Margaret sat frozen, her breath shallow, her hands clutching the edges of the table as the video continued playing on the laptop screen. Her eyes refused to blink, unwilling to miss a single second of what she was witnessing. Every movement Robert made felt like a betrayal cutting deep into her soul. The man she had fed, bathed, and carried through life for 23 years now walked freely, his body showing no signs of the paralysis she had so tirelessly tended to. Her mind struggled to make sense of it. The doctors had confirmed his condition, the tests, the physical therapists, the medical expenses. Everything had pointed to a man who was incapable of moving on his own. And yet, here he was, stretching his arms, rolling his neck and casually rummaging through the kitchen as if none of it had ever been real. She watched in horror as he opened the refrigerator, pulled out food with his bare hands, and ate greedily, something he had supposedly been unable to do for decades. A wave of nausea hit her as she thought back to all the nights she had spoon-fed him, patiently waiting as he took tiny, labored bites. She had cleaned him, turned him in his bed, wiped his tears when he looked at her with helplessness in his eyes. How many times had she cried herself to sleep, exhausted from the weight of responsibility? How many dreams had she sacrificed? How many moments of her life had she given away for a man who had been deceiving her all along? Her gaze darted back to the screen just in time to see Robert glance around cautiously before moving toward the living room. He sat down on the couch, something she had never once seen him do, stretching out his legs and letting out a contented sigh. The image of him, lying limp and lifeless in bed, was shattered now, replaced by the truth she never could have imagined. Tears burned in Margaret's eyes, but they did not fall. Anger boiled in her chest, rising like a fire that refused to be contained. He had stolen her life. He had taken advantage of her kindness, her love, her unwavering devotion. And for what? What possible reason could he have had to pretend for all these years? A cold realization settled in her gut. This was no accident, no miraculous recovery. This had been intentional. He had been lying to her, manipulating her, controlling her in the most insidious way possible. And now, as the video came to an end and the screen went dark, she knew one thing for certain: she could never look at him the same way again. Margaret sat at the table, the weight of 23 years pressing down on her shoulders like an unbearable burden. The laptop screen had gone black, but the images were burned into her mind. Robert standing, stretching, eating on his own. It played in a vicious loop in her head, each repetition cutting deeper, unraveling everything she had believed to be true. The man she had loved, cared for, sacrificed her life for, had been lying to her all along. Her hands clenched into fists as she pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the floor. She turned her gaze toward the bedroom, where Robert lay in the same position she had left him that morning, motionless, silent, playing the role he had perfected over 2 decades. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took slow, deliberate steps toward him. Every step fueled by the betrayal, by the wasted years, by the cruel deception he had orchestrated. She stood at the doorway for a long moment watching him. He looked so frail, so helpless, an illusion she now saw through, a monster disguised as a victim. Her fingers curled at her sides as she forced herself to speak, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Wake up, Robert." His eyelids fluttered slightly, a groggy pretense of waking from sleep. His eyes met hers, the same dull, distant look she had grown used to. But now she knew better. She had seen the truth. "You're not paralyzed." The words hung in the air like a loaded gun, the silence between them stretching unbearably. For the first time in 23 years, Robert didn't respond with a blank stare. His eyes flickered with something else, something sharp, something aware. Margaret's breath hitched as she caught it, the briefest hesitation, the faintest crack in his carefully constructed act. She stepped closer, her hands trembling, but not with fear, with rage. "I saw you," she whispered. "I saw you walk. I saw you eat. I saw everything." A long pause. Then something shifted in Robert's expression. The weak, lifeless mask melted away, revealing something Margaret never thought she would see. He smirked. It was small, barely there, but she saw it. A cold chill ran down her spine. All these years, she had been his prisoner, not his caretaker. She had given him her life, her time, her love, and he had taken it all while secretly laughing at her. Her stomach twisted with disgust. How long had he been waiting for this moment? Had he always known she would eventually figure it out? Or had he simply grown too comfortable in his deception? The thought made her sick. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand answers, but deep down she already knew. This wasn't just a lie, it was something far worse. And the man lying before her wasn't helpless at all. He was something else entirely. Margaret's breath came in slow, measured inhales, her hands trembling at her sides as she stared at the man she thought she had known, the man she had sacrificed everything for, the man who had just smirked at her as if the last 23 years of deception were nothing more than a game. She wanted to scream, to demand why, but she knew deep down that no answer would ever be enough. What excuse could possibly justify wasting her life? What could make up for the loneliness, the exhaustion, the years she had spent believing she was caring for a helpless man? Robert exhaled slowly, his face shifting from amusement to something darker, something unnervingly calm. He wasn't panicked, he wasn't ashamed. He simply looked at her, as if waiting to see what she would do next. Margaret clenched her fists. "Say something," she finally snapped, her voice hoarse with betrayal. "Tell me why you did this. Tell me why you let me—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, because the truth was unbearable. Robert's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, but enough to send a shiver down her spine. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the weak, frail one she had been used to, but something steady, something unsettling. "Because I could." The words were like a slap to the face. Margaret took a step back, her legs suddenly unsteady. That was it, that was his reason. He had stolen her life, manipulated her, let her believe he was suffering, just because he could. The betrayal burned like acid in her chest, but beneath it, something else stirred, a realization. He had never needed her. He had never been grateful. He had only been controlling her, keeping her trapped in this house, in this role, in this endless cycle of care and sacrifice. "Do you know how easy it was?" Robert continued, his voice almost amused now. "How quickly you gave up your life for me. I didn't even have to ask. You just did it. You made it so easy." Margaret's nails dug into her palms. The weight of the years crashed over her all at once. Every sleepless night, every tear shed in exhaustion, every dream abandoned because she had believed she was doing the right thing. He had been watching, knowing, reveling in her suffering. A deep rage settled in her bones, unlike anything she had ever felt before. But with it came clarity. For the first time in 23 years, she saw Robert for what he truly was, not a helpless man, not a victim, but a liar, a manipulator. And for the first time, she realized something else. She wasn't trapped anymore. Margaret straightened, her pulse steadying. She had spent over 2 decades tending to a man who never needed her. But that ended now. She wouldn't waste another second. Robert seemed to sense the shift in her, his expression faltering for the first time. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice losing its edge, becoming something weaker. Margaret turned, walking toward the door without answering. She had wasted enough words, enough time, enough of her life. She wasn't going to waste another moment looking back. Margaret didn't stop walking, not when Robert called her name, not when his voice shifted from amusement to something almost pleading. She had spent 23 years listening, obeying, sacrificing, but not anymore. Every step she took toward the front door felt like shedding a weight she had carried for far too long. Behind her, Robert's voice grew sharper. "Margaret, stop!" She didn't. For the first time in decades, she was making a choice for herself. The realization sent a strange, almost unfamiliar sense of power surging through her veins. How had she let this go on for so long? How had she not seen what was right in front of her? She had spent over 2 decades trapped in this house, in this role, in this lie, and he had let her. No, he had wanted her to. She reached the front door, her hand hovering over the knob. The house had never felt like a prison until this moment. She had mistaken duty for love, sacrifice for devotion. She had allowed herself to be controlled without ever realizing she was being manipulated. But now, standing here, she finally saw the truth. The life she thought she was living had been a lie, and she refused to live in it any longer. Robert's voice came again, this time laced with something she had never heard from him before. Panic. "You won't leave." Margaret turned slightly, her fingers still resting on the door handle. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the truth had unraveled. He was sitting up in bed now, fully upright, his expression no longer calm and composed. There was no more pretending, no more deception, just him, exposed for what he was. "I took care of you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I gave you everything." Robert's hands clenched the sheets. "You needed me." Margaret felt a strange, hollow laugh rise in her throat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You needed me to need you." The words hung between them, heavier than anything she had ever said before, and from the way Robert's face twisted, she knew she was right. This was never about weakness. It was never about paralysis. It was about power, about control. And for 23 years, she had given him both without realizing it. But that ended now. She turned the knob, the door creaking open. The sunlight hit her face, warm and golden, a stark contrast to the cold shadows of the house she was leaving behind. It felt different. It felt like freedom. Behind her, Robert moved, a sound of urgency, of desperation, of a man realizing he was losing everything he had built. "Margaret!" She didn't look back, not this time. She stepped outside,